Canty's stay in solitary confinement had broken something inside him. 7 months in that cold, dark, isolated cell had slowly eaten away at his soul. His thoughts turned increasingly darker as time went by, and the more he thought about Vera, the more his anger grew, not at her, but at the people who had put him in this position. Every night he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining Honorable Suzy, Boyo, and even Chief Jeremiah Camson paying for their roles in ruining his life. He couldn't even count the number of times his case had been adjourned with no resolution in sight. The thought of revenge became his only comfort. When he was finally returned to the general prison population, it felt as if he was emerging from a grave. His fellow inmates welcomed him back, cheering and clapping like he had returned from war. Some offered him cigarettes, others patted him on the back. But Canty had changed. The once warm and kind man who found peace in cutting hair was now cold, detached, and filled with a burning need for justice, his own brand of justice. His interactions became sharp, his words clipped. He didn't smile or laugh anymore. It wasn't long before one of the inmates, a man who had been in prison long enough to know everyone's business, pulled him aside and shared some information that made Canty's blood run cold. Black Tank came back for a month, and then he disappeared again, the inmate said in a low, conspiratorial tone. Canty had heard of Black Tank. Everyone in the prison knew about him. He was a notorious enforcer for Honorable Suzy, used whenever dirty work needed to be done, and the prison served as his safe haven whenever he needed to lie low. Canty knew that Black Tank had been sent back to prison after Canty's arrest, but what he didn't know was why. "What message did he leave for me?" Canty asked, his jaw clenched. He said, "Tell Canty he's in deep shit. He's in Suzy's pocket now. There's no way out." The inmate's voice was cold, as though the words themselves were dangerous. That revelation shattered whatever hope Canty had left. He understood now. His arrest wasn't just bad luck. It had been a calculated move by powerful people, Honorable Suzy and Chief Jeremiah Camson. Canty was a pawn in their game, and Black Tank was the enforcer who ensured everything went according to plan. Knowing this, Canty realized he was in more danger than ever before. If they could plant drugs on him once, they could do it again, or worse. The weight of the situation crushed him. Canty felt trapped not only within the prison walls, but also by the invisible web of power and corruption that had ensnared him. He couldn't escape, and now he had to live with the knowledge that his future, if he had one at all, was out of his hands. In desperation, he demanded to see his lawyer. He had to fight back. Meanwhile, Vera's world was collapsing in on her as well. She was now in her final month of pregnancy, and with each passing day, the pressure from her family grew more intense. Her father, Chief Jeremiah Camson, had already made plans for her to marry Boyo Suzy after the baby was born. Honorable Suzy was already boasting to his political allies about the powerful union between their families, and Boyo's excitement was palpable. But Vera was suffocating under the weight of it all. She couldn't go through with the wedding. Every time she looked in the mirror, all she could see was Canty, the man she truly loved, the father of the child she carried. She couldn't let her family, Boyo, or anyone else dictate her future. She had to escape. Late one night, while everyone else was asleep, Vera went to the only person she could trust, her cousin Suzy, who lived far up the north coast. Suzy had always been there for her, and throughout this entire ordeal, she had been Vera's confidant. Vera knew that Suzy would help her, no questions asked. She called Suzy from an internet cafe, her voice urgent but quiet. "Suzy, I'm coming to stay with you. I'm going to have the baby at your place, but no one must know. I'll send you money to prepare. Just stock up the house with everything we'll need. I'll also send you a list of clothes to buy for me. I'm leaving with nothing but the clothes on my back." Suzy didn't ask any questions. She simply said, "I'll be ready." Vera ended the call, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was running out of time. The wedding was approaching, and once she delivered the baby, the pressure from her father and Boyo would be unbearable. She had to leave before they locked her into a life she didn't want. The only question was how she would get away without anyone noticing. When she returned home, she found Boyo sitting in the living room with her father. They were deep in conversation, their voices low but serious. She knew they were discussing her future, her life, without her consent. She motioned for the maid to bring her the intercom handset. She held it to her ear, eavesdropping on their conversation. The bits she caught sent shivers down her spine. "We'll have her deliver the baby in another country," Boyo was saying. "That way, we can control the situation." Her father agreed. "Yes, once the baby is born, the wedding can take place immediately. No delays." Vera's stomach twisted. They had already decided on her life without even consulting her. She wasn't a person to them anymore. She was a pawn, a vessel carrying the future heir to their legacy. They would take her away, isolate her, and force her to marry Boyo the moment the baby was born. That night, as she lay in bed, Vera's mind raced. She didn't have time to waste. She had to expedite her plans to leave. She couldn't involve her mother. Though her mother had always been sympathetic, she was too loyal to Chief Camson to betray him. Instead, Vera scribbled a note, explaining her decision and telling her mother not to worry. She would leave it behind when she fled, knowing her mother would find it once she was gone. But there was still the matter of the escape itself. With only days before her father and Boyo whisked her away to a foreign country, she had to act fast. She packed a small bag with essentials and waited for the right moment. Canty, meanwhile, was spiraling deeper into his own darkness. His lawyer, a young man with idealistic dreams of justice, had come to visit him but brought little hope. The case was a mess, with evidence stacked against Canty in ways that seemed insurmountable. "The drugs, it's all circumstantial," the lawyer explained. "But the weight of the accusations is heavy. It's going to be hard to clear your name." Canty sat silently, his face stony. He wasn't surprised. He knew this was all orchestrated by Honorable Tecumseh. But how could he fight a man with that much power? "Is there anything we can do?" Canty asked, his voice low and bitter. The lawyer hesitated before responding. "We could try to appeal the decision to deny bail, but the judge is under pressure. There are rumors that Suzy has his hands in this case. It's not going to be easy." Canty's eyes darkened. "Do whatever it takes," he said, clenching his fists. "I'm not staying here forever." As the lawyer left, Canty felt the walls of the prison closing in on him. He had to get out. Not just for himself, but for Vera too. He needed to see her, to hold her, to tell her he loved her. But with every passing day, that dream seemed further and further away. The night before Vera was set to flee, she packed her small bag carefully, slipping out of her house while everyone slept. She left the note for her mother on the kitchen counter, knowing it would break her heart to find it. But there was no other choice. Vera couldn't let herself be trapped. She made her way to the bus station, her heart pounding in her chest as she boarded the bus that would take her north. Her plan was simple: get to Suzy's, give birth in peace, and then figure out what to do next. But as the bus pulled away from the station, Vera couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Back in prison, Canty received a note. It was slipped to him by a guard who had been paid off by one of the inmates sympathetic to Canty's plight. The note was from Suzy. "Canty," it read, "Vera is coming to me. She's going to have the baby here. I'll keep her safe, but you need to find a way to get out." Canty's heart leapt. Vera was still fighting for them, still trying to be free. But how could he reach her? He was trapped in a prison cell, and even with the lawyer's efforts, the odds were stacked against him. He crumpled the note in his fist, determination burning in his chest. He had to escape, no matter what it took. The next day, Canty began to plan. He knew the prison well. He had spent months observing the guards, the routines, and the weak spots. He would find a way. Canty sat on the edge of his narrow bed in the cold cell, his head resting heavily in his hands. The idea of escaping had consumed him over the past few days, filling his thoughts with reckless ambition and the thrill of freedom. But reality had set in. Running meant living a life of constant fear and hiding, a life where he would always look over his shoulder, wondering if today was the day they would catch up to him. He wasn't sure he could live that way, not when there was a part of him that still believed in a future. His hairstyling business, his quiet dreams, and most of all Vera. He thought about his shop, the joy it used to bring him, and the customers he had made friends with. He thought about the ease with which he used to move through life, and then he thought about Vera, whose face had become a bittersweet memory. How could he run away from everything, including her? How could he leave behind the love they shared, a love that still burned brightly in his chest despite the prison walls and the weight of his wrongful conviction? Canty shook his head, pushing the thoughts of escape away. He wasn't a coward. He wasn't going to run. He was going to fight his case, no matter how long it took. Tomorrow he would be back in court. His lawyer had mentioned the possibility of bail, but Canty wasn't holding his breath. The odds were stacked against him, and now there was a new allegation, a sign that Honorable Tecumseh's grip on his life was tightening. Canty knew he had to be cautious. He would stay, fight, and do whatever it took to prove his innocence, even if it meant spending more time in prison. He closed his eyes, imagining the day he would walk out of there, a free man with his head held high. But a dark voice inside him warned that the fight ahead was going to be long and grueling. Still, he had no choice but to persevere. Meanwhile, Vera's journey to the north coast was long and restless. The Marco Polo bus sped through the night, its engine humming as it cut through the dense plantations and villages that dotted the landscape. Vera shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The baby had been kicking more than usual, as if sensing the tension in her heart. Her thoughts drifted back to that night into Ringer Motel, the night when Canty had held her, kissed her, and promised her a future they both knew was slipping away. She could still hear his voice, soft yet filled with the weight of the world, telling her how much he loved her. It hurt to think about him now, locked away in that horrible prison, while she fled to safety, leaving behind the chaos her life had become. She tried to sleep, but the minutes dragged on, filled with the rhythmic sway of the bus and the distant hum of the road beneath them. Vera sobbed quietly at times, thinking about her mother, her father, and the mess she had left behind. But she smiled too, thinking about the life she was about to create with her baby, far away from the controlling grip of the Suzy family. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and Vera dozed off, her mind swirling with dreams of Canty, of freedom, and of an uncertain future. The next morning, Canty was escorted to court, his hands shackled as usual. He had grown used to the heavy weight of the chains around his wrists, but today felt different. His gut twisted with anxiety, knowing that the new allegations would make his case even more complicated. As he entered the courtroom, his eyes scanned the room, searching for any familiar faces. And there, sitting a few rows behind his lawyer, was Mrs. Jimmy, his aunt. Canty's breath caught in his throat. Mrs. Jimmy had been on vacation when everything happened. He had sent her a message, hoping she would come back in time to help him, and here she was. But next to her sat a man Canty didn't recognize. Fair-skinned, with long hair tied neatly at the nape of his neck, the man sat close to Mrs. Jimmy, whispering to her every few moments. Who was he? Canty wondered, a frown creasing his brow. As the trial commenced, Canty's lawyer fought valiantly for bail, but the new charges made it difficult. It was clear that someone, Honorable Tecumseh, most likely, was pulling strings behind the scenes. The judge adjourned the case once again, setting a new hearing date for 6 weeks later. The disappointment was crushing, but Canty remained stoic. He had no choice but to endure. Before he was led out of the courtroom, Canty caught Mrs. Jimmy's eye. She gave him a small nod, a sign that she hadn't given up on him. But there was something in her eyes, something that made Canty feel uneasy. Was it pity? Fear? He couldn't tell. Back in his cell, the cold air stung his skin as he lay on the hard bed, staring at the ceiling. The presence of the strange man beside Mrs. Jimmy gnawed at him. Who was he, and what role did he play in all of this? Vera had finally arrived at the north coast, where Suzy was waiting for her. Suzy's warm smile and comforting hug were a balm to Vera's frayed nerves. Without wasting any time, Suzy drove her straight to a medical facility, where Vera registered for her prenatal care. The doctor conducted a few tests and reassured Vera that everything was fine with the baby. But as Vera lay on the examination table, her mind kept drifting back to the life she had left behind. That evening, as she settled into the small but cozy house Suzy had prepared for her, Vera allowed herself a moment of peace. She knew that she was safe for now, but the weight of what she had done hung over her like a cloud. The note she had left for her mother had been hastily written, but every word came from her heart. She hadn't wanted to hurt her mother, but there had been no other way. Vera needed to escape, and this was the only way she could think of to protect her child and herself from a life of control and manipulation. Back in the Camson household, Vera's note had sparked a storm of emotions. Her mother, Mrs. Camson, had read it with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe that her daughter had left without saying goodbye. The words in the note were full of pain, and it broke her heart to think that Vera had been suffering in silence for so long. Without hesitation, Mrs. Camson had taken the note to her husband, Chief Jeremiah Camson. He was furious, his face turning an angry shade of red as he crumpled the note in his fist. "How do I explain this to the Suzy family?" he roared, pacing the room in a rage. "Our daughter has run off. What will they think? What will Boyo say? This is a disgrace." Mrs. Camson tried to calm him down, but her own grief made it difficult. She knew how much pressure their daughter had been under, but she hadn't expected Vera to take such drastic action. Now, with Vera gone, their home felt empty, as if a dark cloud had descended upon them. Boyo Suzy, too, was beside himself with anger. He had stormed out of the estate, driving recklessly as he tried to make sense of Vera's disappearance. He had loved her, or so he thought, and now she was gone, taking their future with her. The entire Camson household was in mourning. The maids moved about in hushed tones, exchanging worried glances as they whispered about Vera's departure. No one dared to speak openly, but the tension in the air was palpable. They all knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger conflict. As the days passed, Vera settled into her new life in the North Coast. Suzy was her constant companion, helping her prepare for the arrival of the baby and offering her the emotional support she desperately needed. But despite the relative peace, Vera couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. She knew that her father wouldn't rest until he found her, and Boyo... Well, she didn't want to think about what Boyo might do if he ever caught up with her. She spent her days quietly, focusing on her health and the baby, but at night, when the world was still and the house was quiet, Vera's mind wandered back to Canty. She hadn't been able to visit him in prison, and the thought of him alone, suffering, made her heart ache. What had become of him? Was he still fighting? Was he still thinking of her? One night, as she lay in bed, the baby's soft kicks keeping her awake, Vera whispered into the darkness, "Canty, wherever you are, I'm thinking of you. I'm still here. I'll wait for you." Canty, in his cold prison cell, stared up at the ceiling, lost in his thoughts. The walls seemed to close in on him, but he held on to the one thing that kept him going, his love for Vera.